On July 31st, 2024, we boarded a Finnair flight at O'Hare to Copenhagen with a slight layover in Helsinki. We stayed at an apartment hotel that had a couple of bedrooms and a kitchen, so we had room to stretch out. While we were there, the Miss Denmark contest was having training, so it was hard for Mary to get me to leave the hotel. We had seen the major sights of Copenhagen on a visit years before, so we spent this day and a half just wandering the city and visiting some art museums, restaurants, and shops. After 2 nights in Copenhagen, we went back to the airport to rent a car, but we ran into a long line. It took us more than an hour to get our car. In the review, I wrote a scathing one, and they came back and said, next time I get a free express to the front of the line, so I got that going for me. Our first stop was about 30 minutes out of Copenhagen in a town called Roskilde. There, the cathedral is the final resting place for all of the kings and queens of Denmark. The place is ginormous, tons of burial crypts in there. In fact, the current queen even has her crypt ready to go. Now, that's what I call planning. From Roskilde, we traveled another 2 hours to the town of Odense. As you can see from the map, we had to cross over an inlet of the North Sea on a bridge several miles long. I don't even want to know how much that toll was. It just got added to my rent-a-car bill. In Odense, we wanted to visit another cathedral, but a wedding had just finished and they closed the doors. So we grabbed something to eat and hit the road. From Odense, we traveled another 2 hours north to Aarhus, the second largest city in Denmark. Mary was not feeling well the next day, so I visited their art museum on my own. This is a view from their glass-tinted observation level. They had an exhibition from the Australian artist Ron Muick, who does these giant sculptures. This is one of me as a 10-pound baby, and another of my brother David, who unsurprisingly has become somewhat of a recluse. So after 2 nights in Aarhus, we jumped in the car for a 4-hour ride down to the quaint island of Ærøskobing. It was now Monday, August 5th. This involved taking a 90-minute ferry with some nice views of the Danish coastline. We had reserved the ferry months ahead of time, but for later in the afternoon. We were able to go standby on one a couple of hours earlier, so that got us into the island early evening. This Airbnb we had a big bedroom and a nice garden, but the TV remote wasn't working. We had half the town over trying to fix it. Not a big deal, as we spent most of our time wandering the historic streets and visiting the harbor. After 2 days on the island, we woke up early, put the rent-a-car on the ferry, and then drove back to Copenhagen. It was much easier dropping the rent-a-car than it was picking it up. We then boarded a train for a 4-hour ride to Kalmar, Sweden. Kalmar is noted for its castle that dates back to the 12th century and the site of several battles between the Danes and the Swedes. Some of the collateral damage from those battles can still be seen sitting around the castle walls. There was also a festival going on in Kalmar with international food and live music. During one of our 3 days in Kalmar, we took a 1-hour train ride to the town of Vaxo, Sweden. Vaxo is famous because it's in the middle of the Swedish glassmaking industry, and they had a museum dedicated to glass artifacts created in the last 2 centuries. We made it through the tour without breaking anything, probably because many of the glass sculptures were up and out of our reach, though I really tried. After 3 days in Kalmar, our next stop was Göteborg, Sweden's second largest city. Still trying to figure out how they got that pronunciation from letters that say to me Gothenburg, but oh well. It was a 4-hour train ride from Kalmar. Our hotel was centrally located above the train station, so it was very convenient to explore the central city, and their botanical gardens were just a short walk away. Mary was under the weather in Göteborg, so I spent the next day, Sunday, visiting their art museum as well as the trendy neighborhood of Haga. After Göteborg, we took the train over to Oslo, our first stop in Norway. We had a loft Airbnb that once again was close to the central rail station. Mary wanted to visit the Royal Palace, even though it was undergoing some major renovations. It's divided up into a number of showrooms and museums, so it took a while to cover it all. Can't say we saw any royalty while we were there, just scruffy tourists like ourselves. The next day we visited some of the museums, including the National Gallery, where we saw Edward Munch's The Scream, supposedly painted after a month-long visit from some of my Spats ancestors. From Oslo, we took the train up to Lillehammer, Norway, site of the 1994 Winter Olympics. Lillehammer is a very picturesque ski town, but not much to do there in the summer season. We took a mile-long hike up to the Olympic Museum. I was not aware that Norway had won so many medals over the year. It seemed like the person and the story behind each medal was detailed in that museum. After our one night in Lillehammer, we took the train back to Oslo. We had to get up early the next day to begin our Norway in a Nutshell tour of the mountains and fjords. The Nutshell tour begins with a 6-hour train ride from Oslo to the town of Myrdal. The views on that ride were more of landscapes, small lakes, and farm fields. It reminded us of Wisconsin or Minnesota. In Myrdal, we had time for lunch as we waited for the train to take us up to the waterfalls in Flam. The brothers running the cafe spoke numerous languages.
Salt, pepper, paprika.
The highlight of the train ride to Flam were the waterfalls. The train stops for about 20 minutes at the most impressive waterfall to allow for photo taking. And if you ever wanted to know what happened to Grace Slick from the Jefferson Airplane, you can find her singing in the mountains of Norway. Once we arrived in Flam, we had about a 1-hour layover as we waited for the ferry to begin loading. There were several tour groups and several ferries at the port. I got the cheapest one, of course, but didn't let Mary know that she'd be rowing. The ferry actually made pretty good time as we traveled north up the fjord. There were a few stops along the way, and several of the tour groups disembarked at some of the small towns scattered along the coast. Our destination was Balestrand, about a 2-hour journey. Mary kept busy snapping photos while I visited the ship's bar. We spent the night in Balestrand, a small coastal town on the fjord. We visited this old church in the center of town. Lots of people ran out when we entered, screaming about it being haunted by this pale ghost. We treated ourselves to dinner at this grand hotel. We tried some of the local dishes like reindeer stew and smoked herring. I can't say we went back for seconds. We had to get up early the next morning to catch the 8 a.m. ferry down to Bergen, Norway. Once again, the ferry made several stops along the way, and as we got closer to Bergen, we began leaving the hills and cliffs behind. We arrived at our hotel in Bergen at noon, but they really held firm to their check-in time of 3 p.m. Mary decided to wait in the hotel lobby, but I went on a two-hour walking tour of the city. This is a statue of Henrik Ibsen. Looks a little freaky, but the guide said those weren't his eyes, those were his glasses. It was now August 17th, but Bergen felt like it was late November. Fronting the North Sea, there was a cold rain on and off, and it never got above the mid-50s. Even the locals admitted that Bergen had the worst weather in Europe. Our hotel was right next to the UNESCO-listed neighborhood of Bryggen. This is a 14th century trading post of the German Hanseatic League, and many of the buildings date back to the early 1700s. We spent Saturday touring and shopping this area, and that night I found a band there playing some Steve Earle. Who'd have thought? Monday morning we caught a flight from Bergen to Stockholm, our last stop in Scandinavia. Our hotel in Stockholm was a couple miles from the city center, but the tram stopped just down the block, so it was easy to get around. We visited the Modern Art Museum, and the Swedes lived up to their reputation for some dark images. One of the highlights of our visit to Stockholm was the Vasa Viking Ship Museum. The Vasa was built in 1628 to be the pride of Sweden, but just after leaving the dock for its maiden voyage, it keeled over and sank. Made me feel better about some of our engineering disasters at Panelglide. The entire ship was raised in the 1980s and beautifully exhibited in this museum. It took a few hours to take it all in. In Stockholm, we had never seen so many babies and strollers. They were everywhere. Some kind of baby boom going on. And there was a park across the street from our hotel. I noticed these kids playing some sort of boy in the bubble game. Not sure what the point was exactly, but it looked a lot safer than the King of the Hill fights we had at recess after they snowplowed and piled the Tommy Moore parking lot. It was now August 21st. We had survived 3 weeks of packing and unpacking. Woohoo! Time to catch the night ferry to Helsinki, Finland, and then on to the Baltics.